Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Nicholas McKay, a first-year graduate student at Technical University Munich's Program of Responsibility in Science, Technology, and Society. This is our 6th episode of STS Shorts, a new video series from Eclectic Spacewalk, in which we dialogue with a researcher, lecturer, writer, and/or eclectic human in the science, technology, and society discipline or related fields. These shorts will only be around 30 minutes in length, and the goal is to highlight and hopefully introduce a new audience to our guests' research and work. Please grab a coffee, drink, and open your curious mind as we dive right in. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Makoto Takahashi. Makoto is currently a Fulbright-Lloyd's Fellow in the Program of Science, Technology, and Society at Harvard's Kennedy School. He previously was a lecturer at Technical University of Munich's STS department. He is also the curator of the Picturing the Invisible art exhibition. Welcome to STS Shorts, Makoto.
Hi there, Nick. Well, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. So can you briefly, kind of give us an overview of your time and before your PhD, and how did you become interested in the STS field in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's a long story, as it always
Definitely.
is on every STS Shorts episode. So I guess one way of telling the story would be to focus on, an event. And it goes all the way back to, I think when I was 18, I was still an undergraduate studying at Cambridge, UK. I'd had a bit of a rough night. I was pulling an all-nighter trying to get some assignment in. And, I had a 9 a.m. lecture, so I dragged myself out of bed. I was just on the way to the lecture hall and I thought, right, I'll pop into my my sort of go-to little Italian cafe. And as I was stood in the queue, they had a beaten up old TV set on top of one of their fridges, and they had the news on. And I caught sight of it out of the corner of my eye, and it was the fact that Japan, the northeastern seaboard, had just been hit by this Richter scale 9 earthquake, and then which was followed by this incredible tsunami.
Yeah.
And over the next couple of days, I was kind of transfixed to TV screens, just constantly watching updates of the news as Japan held its breath because cooling systems at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant had failed. And over the next couple of days, we had meltdowns in 3 reactors. And all of a sudden, Japan became the site of the worst nuclear disaster that the world had seen since Chernobyl.
Yeah.
And one of the threads that came out of that was that I thought, well, this is the thing that I have to study. I'd been searching for an undergraduate thesis topic at the time, and I suppose, 3 degrees and more than a decade later, here I am.
Right.
I suppose that that story maybe makes it sound a little bit like something happened, and then all of a sudden you become an STS scholar, which of course we know isn't the truth either. And maybe another way of telling the story would be to say that it was a slow engagement with ideas and people that were engaged with STS, and for a lot longer than I necessarily recognized at the time. My degrees were in the geography department, and one of the wonderful things about British geography is that it's eclectic. Some might say intellectually promiscuous. It will draw on anything that it finds interesting. So it gives you this great sense of freedom. And looking back, I remember sort of reading Sheila Jasanoff's work, Bruno Latour's work, Sarah Watmore's work, because they were assigned on my undergraduate courses.
I see.
Long before I necessarily recognized STS as a distinct field.
Right.
And that continued over time in the sense that, for example, I was later an intern at the Centre for Science and Policy, in Cambridge, UK. It's this wonderful organization that tries to bring academics and policymakers around the table to work on things of common interest. And again, Rob Doubleday who's the director there, had previously been a Harvard STS fellow, and used to run these wonderful reading groups in the basement of CSAP, where it was some academics, some policymakers discussing a reading a week. And again, I was being encouraged to engage with a lot of, core STS ideas and texts. but perhaps without entirely being cognizant of that. And I think the shift really came towards the end of my PhD when I came to Harvard as an STS fellow.
Okay.
And I think, that's the first moment in which you'll see STS pop up on my CV. But I think it's also the moment in which I went from thinking of myself as a geographer that, drew on some STS literature, or, thought of myself as like working at the intersection, and really started to think of myself as, an STS scholar, as some kind of identity.
And do you remember any specific text? I know you mentioned Sheila and Bruno Latour, but was there maybe one that, caught or still you think of today as like being very generative and very thought-provoking, even before you were really STSer?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, from Sheila's work, I think it was Science at the Bar I remember reading.
Okay.
And I was fascinated by this idea of, studying in ethnographic detail, the ways in which, who is granted the cultural authority of science within the law could be approached. And I think I was probably encouraged towards that by Alex Jeffrey, my master's and PhD supervisor, who was himself a critical legal scholar. And he was interested in kind of post-conflict states, particularly Bosnia. So this idea of like how you perform the authority of an institution was a kind of key thing that I was grappling with. And Sheila's work, really kind of stood out in my memory as something that helped answer those questions.
Wow. And then now you're, studying under her once again after your fellowship. That's quite interesting. So into my next question, I guess, is like, so you began your career in the UK with some field work in Japan, then taught in Germany here, and now you're back in the US after, a fellowship. Are there really any insights into how STS is researched between the places? I think you're kind of alluding to some of the cultural, political, socio-technical kind of like differences, but like, do you have any, real insights that stick out of between those places?
Sure. I mean, I suppose you can take your question in two ways, right? So one is about what does STS look like in each of these four different countries?
Sure.
Which is a kind of institutional question. STS is more or less institutionalized in different places. Obviously, we met. Maybe we should say this too.
I was going to say, like, full disclosure a little later, but yes.
So Nicholas was one of my students at TUM, Technical University Munich, which now has Germany's first dedicated STS department. But that itself is a relatively recent thing. When I first started at TUM, all of 3 days after handing in my PhD thesis, it was still an interdisciplinary research center called the Munich Center for Technology and Society.
Right.
And so this has been a constitutional moment. Like STS is sort of arriving in Germany, at least, or going to a new level. In the UK, my experience of engaging with it through geography was that it tended to be a research group within the geography department. So we had a research cluster called Geographies of Knowledge, which engaged very heavily with STS literature and themes. When I was at Cambridge, it was led by Mike Hume, who is notable for having been a key member of the IPCC and also writing a lot about kind of the production of expertise in international organizations. Japan again, has a budding STS community. But as far as or at least when I was there, it wasn't, I wasn't in an STS department. So I was a visiting fellow during my PhD fieldwork at Waseda University, where I worked with the wonderful Mikihito Tanaka, who it focuses a lot on science communication. And I think is the research director of, and I always get this name wrong. I think it's the Science Media Center Japan, but if I've got the acronym wrong, please do forgive me. But there, there were STS conferences, certainly, and it feels like the community is growing, but it certainly wasn't in departmental form. And then, of course, in the US, right, we have places like Cornell, which, has a fantastic STS department. long-term listeners of STS Shorts will have heard Shavita talk a little bit about her experience of the Cornell department. But at Harvard, for example, again, we're a program within the Kennedy School. We're not our own department. So yeah, we in that sense, you see the different ways in which this kind of young discipline is being institutionalized in different countries. But perhaps the more profound thing is, I think if you spend a lot of time in different countries, you can't help but engage with the fact that the way in which science interfaces with the state and the ways in which we institutionalize the relationship between science and democracy is so obviously different in these different countries. And yet I think if you're embedded in one particular location, it's so easy just to think, well, no, that's the way it is, right? That's just science. Science speaks with one voice. It's the same wherever you go. I think one of the great boons of having got to travel so much is, kind of experiencing firsthand just how different the same supposedly scientific issue can look in different contexts.
Yeah, and that's honestly been my kind of experience, just seeing not just like different people and researching and scholarship and departments, but then also there's kind of a through line of interesting kind of I don't know. I hate to say eclectic because you use it, and then also that's from Eclectic Spacewalk. But at the same time, I think that it brings together a lot of interesting different perspectives and kind of methodologies and things like that, but all around the shared kind of aspects of STS, which, we'll kind of get into. And I guess that's the easiest way to get into the next question of like, what are some aspects of the discipline of STS that maybe, we need more of, or possibly less of, or how can, kind of the field improve, itself through a reflexive lens? Because that's one of the things that I've found most profound about STS is at least it's being reflexive in some way. It's trying to investigate itself and how methodologies, how, these systems of knowledge production kind of come about. So I don't know, like what your kind of thought process is on that, or if you have something to say. But especially, I think that you would maybe have an interesting kind of outlook because you have had so many experiences in different places that along the shared, discipline of STS.
Absolutely. So I think one of the things is whether or not we see ourselves as a discipline or not.
Oh, good.
Which I think is a contested question. I certainly fall in the camp of thinking of STS as a discipline with, its own unique sort of history, its own kind of theoretical development, and its own associated methods. But, I think some people do also engage with it as a kind of interdisciplinary field. But I suppose the way to link the two elements of your question together is, well, why do I see it as a distinct discipline? And that then helps us answer, well, what are the things that maybe we need more of? And I think for me, on some deep fundamental level, I do think the concept of symmetry is the kind of shibboleth of STS. And I think it leads to, really rich, interesting insights into kind of science policy issues. So, taking the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, which is very much the thing that I've principally focused on for a lot of my, academic career, if you're allowed to call anything a career at 29. But I think one of the things that I found frustrating when I first started engaging with the literature was that I think most people tacitly take the assumption that either nuclear power is safe or nuclear power is dangerous, and a lot of their reasoning kind of flows from that point. And so although sometimes it's done through a kind of constructivist lens where they're saying, right, we need to look at the ways in which institutions create this perception, it often has this kind of element of unmasking, right? That if you think that, for example, nuclear power is terribly dangerous and you're critical of the way in which the Japanese state has handled the disaster, then, you start from the position of saying, right, well, things are down, the risk is downplayed, right? And to say something is downplayed means that you think that there must be a real risk, right? A comparison point. And you're saying, well, it isn't this, it is this implicitly. And the same is also true of a lot of people that, are kind of nuclear boosterists, who very much engage in the kind of discourse of this is massively overplayed. People are irrationally afraid of nuclear power. In the management of the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, this idea that people are obsessed unnecessarily over really quite small doses of radiation. They reel out but you get more radiation exposure from eating a banana or flying on a plane or whatever, so people shouldn't be concerned about this health risk. And I think one of the interesting things that, the STS kind of lens of symmetry can give you is, rather than saying, well, I believe the risk is this, and therefore I have to explain the deviation from this. You can treat these positions symmetrically, right? It's this idea that you should be able to explain in the same terms both things that you think are true and false, right? But you're trying to explain why people believe these things, how these communities institutionalize these beliefs and stabilize them. And so, you're studying both the kind of invisibilization of nuclear risk that various, you might argue that the nuclear industry and various state institutions are involved in terms of trying to downplay it, quote unquote, downplay. But at the same time, you can also study, as a cultural phenomenon, the history of nuclear fear, the ways in which people engaging with this nuclear disaster are also informed by, a history of anti-nuclear movements, but also, media, right? We have a whole rich history of movies and imagery that we bring to bear in kind of grappling with this invisible, intangible threat.
So many lenses, I guess you could say, that you do that, but one symmetrical lens. So maybe let's go back to your PhD thesis, because I think this is interesting to kind of get in a little bit more context as like expertise, authority, et cetera. So your PhD thesis dissertation, in the US, some people call it the improvised expert, performing expert authority after Fukushima, 2011 to 2018. So, quote, this thesis examines how claims to expert authority are made in conditions of low public trust, focusing on the debates surrounding civilian radiation exposure in Japan. So you kind of talked a little bit about that fear and et cetera, but then what I'm most interested, at least in my kind of media communications background, especially, is low public trust and then expertise and like where the authority comes from. So I guess, I definitely skimmed it. I didn't read all of it, Mac, but because it's quite long. But yeah, so can you tell us a little bit more of like, that was the kind of starting thing for you, other than say your undergraduate thesis or maybe your crown jewel of working? So like, what can we kind of learn from your insights of research to then kind of put to our own STS and symmetrical reflexive lens on something like the 3/11 disaster?
Sure. So I think one of the things that really motivated that thesis was looking at the way in which limits, particularly limits to radiation exposure, as related to the idea of public health, became this incredibly hotly contested issue in Japan. And there's a quote that I really like by G.K. Chesterton, who sort of says that like art, like morality, means drawing the line somewhere. And as I did field work in Japan, over the years, that quote just kept going round and round in my head. And it really struck me that, well, so too does so much of policymaking, and indeed, the management of a nuclear disaster, that, experts and policymakers are constantly being called upon to decide, where's safe to live, what's safe to eat, who needs additional protections, whether or not that's in the form of, potassium iodide pills or particular behavioral interventions around like not being outside. People are constantly being asked to draw these lines that demarcate the idea of the safe from the dangerous, the acceptable risk from the unacceptable risk. But they're also doing that in, as you said, conditions of low public trust, that, this is a moment which shakes a lot of people's faith in the Japanese state in particular, that these nuclear facilities have been built in what has been called a kind of zero risk culture, in which people were assured that these things were entirely safe, that the technical prowess of Japan meant that a disaster could never happen. And there's been a lot of interesting critical work which argues that, the maintenance of this myth of safety itself becomes a kind of root cause of the disaster, in the sense that if you keep insisting that things are absolutely safe, you can't really identify and do something about risks that you might be alerted to. And indeed, many of the sort of technical failures at the Fukushima Daiichi plant had been flagged at some point. And these were all just, quietly buried or lost, or, never really acted upon. And so, people are understandably upset, right? They experience the disaster not just as this, kind of force majeure, oh, it's an earthquake and a tsunami, but also this deep failing of the state, that this very tight culture that, like, lots of people call the nuclear village, where you have lots of revolving doors between government, bureaucracy, and industry, leads to this kind of collusive culture, which means that the nuclear regulators, fail in their function. And the Madarame Haruki, who was the head of Japan's nuclear regulator, in 2012 in public hearings, basically said that they were kind of reduced to pretty much rubber stamping things. I think one of the phrases he uses is, we came up with excuses as to why Japan didn't have to meet international standards. And so, you have this emergency situation in which people are rightly pointing to, failures of the state and its regulatory culture. And yet you also then have to reassure people that, and make these claims to expert authority, right? This idea that, well, no, the policies that we're implementing now have a sound basis. And that really was the thing that I found fascinating, and it motivated so much of the PhD fieldwork, in the sense that you have this question of, well, who should you trust, right? As a layperson, if you have different experts, with different kind of institutional credentials, saying different things about whether or not these safety standards are or aren't sufficient, on what basis do we make that choice? And so one of the things I was interested in was trying to produce an account of a kind of Japanese style of public reason, right? In what are the kind of culturally specific ways in which Japan asks experts to perform their authority, how to present their results, and how does Japan ask or hold accountable various experts? And then,
so go into a little bit more to your next, a piece that you got published in the Journal of European Association for the Study of Science and Technology, and you quote, "Nuclear disasters do not end; they fade away." And that's a brilliant opening line of how, like, this is still going on. There's still much social science happening, and so maybe tie that in from not just like looking back through a lens of, say, the past, but then actively like engaging with a disaster that continues to go, and then continues to and unfold, I guess you could say, in a lower public trust arena, because then you said celebrating what has been achieved and diagnosing what is yet to be done. Again, that symmetry that you kind of brought up. It's an interesting piece of quote. It's called Studying Up, and I'll link it in the show notes and description. But like, how does that transition from kind of the PhD to then, it being 10 years ago, now the anniversary of 10 years has passed. And then, we kind of look back on with an STS lens or a reflexive lens. And there's still much to be done, but there can be some kind of maybe I don't use the word celebrations, but there has been things achieved in kind of learning from such an event like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the studying up piece, I mean, the studying up piece was written really to kind of mark the 10-year anniversary. And as much as anything else, that's a reflection on STS engagements and maybe perhaps broader social science engagements with Fukushima over the last 10 years. Though, of course, you know, as you rightly point out, it's not just that social scientific work is still going on, it's that these things are still happening on the ground, right? There are still people who aren't able to return to their homes. You know, I think it's around 200,000 people were displaced from their homes by the Fukushima Daiichi disaster.
I mean, there's active court cases going on, right, with cancer stuff and benefits being pushed out. Like it's still an active zone. Like there's many things that are not just about, you know, the social science. Like this is, like you said, on the ground, still happening.
Absolutely. You know, and you know, so yes, 100% court cases. There is also the continual contestation of whether or not people should return to Fukushima or not, right? That as the government decontaminates much of the evacuated zones, they lift evacuation orders on particular prefectures using, I believe, a 20 millisievert per year exposure reference level, which lots of people argue is inadequate. Prior to the disaster, it was generally 1 millisievert per year that was considered safe for civilian habitation. But also, you know, but of course, this then creates financial pressure in the sense that the minute that you are no longer a kind of compulsory evacuee, you stop receiving types of support from the state. This creates a kind of financial incentive to return to Fukushima. So every time more evacuation orders are lifted, this kind of contestation about where is safe to live and are these measures adequate bubbles up again. You know, and then there's the question of, well, what do you return to if you do go back to Fukushima? That, you know, some of these places are heavily agricultural. People understandably don't want to eat produce labeled made in Fukushima. But as with many places in Japan, you know, certain types of agricultural produce, things like anbokaki, which are like dried persimmons, cucumbers, peaches, grain, you know, these were all proud Fukushima exports that people loved. And, you know, it's, for a lot of people, there's also an economic disincentive to return, right? That you can return to your farm, but it's laid fallow for however many years. You've got to get the farm back up and running. And, you know, people may not want to buy your produce, or certainly might not be willing to pay the premium that they once paid for kind of Fukushima produce before the disaster. So I think we should probably, I just wanted to foreground that just because I think that particular piece that you're talking about, which I promise I am coming to, is kind of about the state of social science 10 years on. But in some sense, you know, the state of social science 10 years on is much less important than the state of, you know, what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, keeping some perspective, even though looking and investigating it.
Absolutely. The basic point of the studying up piece was that I think in some ways, what we have done incredibly well over the past 10 years is to look at the disaster from below. You know, I think we've answered the Nobel laureate Kenzaburo Oe's call, you know, to look at the disaster from the perspective of those most affected by it. You know, and so we have wonderful like ethnographies of, for example, life in evacuation shelters that Brigitte Steger has produced, or, you know, fantastic ethnographies by people like Maxime Polari, who looks at citizen radiation monitoring organizations, you know, these small NGOs that sprung up where people would monitor their own radiation exposure, but also how contaminated various foodstuffs were. But it struck me that on some level, we've studied up less. That, you know, certainly people who write critical accounts about the Japanese state or in various international organizations that are involved in managing the disaster. But there are fewer accounts of life in a ministry, right? Like how do people what is the culture of a ministry? Like,
right.
how do people see the disaster, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do they organize around it? What are the lenses that they're using? And ditto for organizations like the International Commission on Radiological Protection, or the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I think that is something that STS can bring a really interesting perspective to. And what I was kind of grappling with in this piece was trying to think, well, why might this be? Why do we have more views from below than views from above? And one explanation that readily pops to mind is that, well, it is practically much, much easier to do kind of ethnography at a grassroots level, right? That, right. Citizens, I've certainly tried to do both. And, like a local citizen science group is usually much more welcoming and much more prepared to open their books than a ministry that doesn't want this strange interloper who, maybe is going to run to a tabloid with some gotcha story, just hanging around. And that really struck me when I was an undergraduate. I got to interview a former cabinet minister, and I turned up at this ministry building, and the House of Councillors, in fact. And I was running a little bit late, but I was sprinting across Tokyo in 30-something degree heat, like desperately pulling my suit jacket on as I went. And I thought, right, I've got there just in time. And as I walked in through the front door, it struck me that there was this kind of airport-style security, and everyone had to line up.
Oh no!
So I think I was, sort of 3 minutes late. I suppose, 8 minutes really. One should always be early. And so my interview started with me bowed to 90 degrees, apologizing for, having wasted their time and being, terribly sorry and really, really hoping that they'd give me the interview anyway. But as you're bowed to 90 degrees, you're like, right, well, like a lot of these kind of traditional ethnographic methods, which are about, like deep hanging out, feels inappropriate in this kind of context and with this power dynamic. This counselor is never going to agree to me just like hanging out with them in a bar every night. And so then, there's this methodological question about how do we get close to these people? But I think there's also another possible explanation, which is that on some level, I do think that we often like to study people that we like, and people that have viewpoints that vaguely, align with our own. That I think many of us, myself included, started work on the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, deeply critical of the political management of it. And so we want to do ethnographies, perhaps on some level, of the various activists and citizen scientists that we see as kind of personal heroes, the people that we see speaking truth to power, rather than spending, time doing ethnography and befriending members of institutions that we might ourselves be critical of. But at the same time, I think, again, coming back to this guiding principle of symmetry, perhaps the richest work can be produced by kind of simultaneously trying to embed yourself in both. Doing both ethnographies of these various citizen science groups, these various activist groups, but also trying to do participant observation in whatever forms possible of these established institutions, and to take seriously the ways in which they narrate themselves and what they're doing and how they see the disaster.
Right. And so like but then you've kind of taken a page out, I guess, the Everman's book or something along that lines, and created a different type of experience with your Picturing the Invisible art exhibition that you're a curator of. I mean, it's a very interesting kind of way to not just do, art, I guess you could say, and raise up voices of people, but then also it can be, it's critical at the same time of with writings and such. So can you tell us a little bit about the exhibit? It's coming here to Tomb next month, or in actually a couple weeks. And so it'll be here for a lot of people to experience that here in Munich. But tell us a little bit about that and how it all came to be. And then also like how, I guess, through those lenses, you can also kind of be critical, but at the same time, enjoy the everyman experience or give voice to, people from above, but then be critical from the top.
Absolutely. So yeah, the Picturing the Invisible exhibition is this collaboration between artists, academics, citizen scientists, authors, and the basic concept was to bring together, I think it's 7 photographers, or at least artists working with film, all of whom had been producing work in the territories affected by the Fukushima Daiichi disaster, and then to pair each of the artworks with an essay from someone who had also engaged with the disaster in some capacity, right. or nuclear issues more generally. And so, yeah, it's a collection of artworks and essays. It is also in some ways a COVID project. Right, which is
good way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, but I think it's a key part of the story that the motivation for doing it was kind of twofold. One was that I was teaching at TUM and I was teaching an immersion project on science communication, which you are one of the students on. So we should also give you a shout out on this, and that you've been instrumental to shaping this exhibition too.
Trying.
And I think my basic idea was that we were in this situation that was robbing students of so much of their ordinary university experience. Nobody could come into classrooms. You weren't having that same kind of bonding in the corridors. There weren't going to be house parties. Right. And I desperately didn't want any of my students to think, oh, if only I'd started in another year. Right. And so to that end, I really wanted to try and offer students something extra. And I was like, right, well, if we're going to do a course on science communication, can we think of a way in which the students at TUM on the Reset Masters course are going to get to do science communication and not just read about it, right? And so the idea was to create an opportunity for students like yourself to have this kind of reflexive learning experience in which, they start to think about science communication and they grapple with the practicality of it. So I should say that it's not just my curation. You and your peers have been involved at every stage of the curation, from helping to select artists, helping to select essayists, thinking about how things could come together and what things we can do in the exhibition space to engage people around the art. I suppose the other way in which COVID kind of motivated the exhibition was this sense that a lot of my research participants, particularly people in citizen science groups, had been really looking forward to the 10-year anniversary, and to some extent to the Tokyo Olympic Games.
Can't forget about that. Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
Not necessarily because they were supportive of it. In fact, they were often deeply critical of it.
For sure.
There was this sense that the Tokyo Olympic Games were self-consciously billed by the Japanese government as the recovery games. Right. The point was to demonstrate to the world that Japan had recovered from the Fukushima Daiichi disaster in particular. And I think a lot of these research informants wanted to use this as an opportunity when these games and then the 10-year anniversary brought the spotlight of the international media back to Japan, to raise their critiques of the Japanese government's handling of the disaster, and to shine a light on the fact that the disaster is far from over. So yeah, but obviously they were looking forward to this. But then because COVID happened, all of a sudden it was totally overshadowed. The 10-year anniversary got very little play in the international media. Understandably, we were facing a different type of public health crisis. And at the same time, the Olympic Games became the COVID Games rather than the kind of 3/11 recovery games.
Right.
And so, you know, I wanted to do whatever I could in some kind of small way to help honor that kind of implicit pact that I think all ethnographers make with their research informants, where they let you into their lives and you kind of promise to tell their stories and kind of share their stories in whatever way you can. And so it was an opportunity to invite some of them to be essayists in this exhibition, which hopefully will get, you know, foreign audiences to engage in some small way with the legacy of the disaster, and to think about the ways in which, you know, Japan, even as it faces this global pandemic, is still grappling with these long-term consequences of the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster.
Yeah, well said, and definitely many props and everything for putting it on, and it has been a very interesting and fruitful and thought-provoking experience working, you know, with you on that, and we're very excited for it to come to Munich and everyone get to see it. But then also, as my small, you know, kind of contribution is also trying to make a little, you know, video or short film so that people, if they cannot come, you know, in person, to then be able to, you know, experience at least a little bit of the exhibit and see, you know, what kind of forms of other science communication, you know, can be valid for not just a disaster, but then also just in the field. So, but yeah, it's been awesome. Thank you so much for, you know, coming on STS Shorts. I think that's kind of all the time we have. And then, yeah, thank you so much, Makoto. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Nick.
Awesome.